when we talk about the Indic traditions, we have often spoken about the subject-object binary through an experiential method of understanding. So the subject-object binary is defined in the way it is because of certain empirical delineations, of certain worldly characterization of things that we see around us. But especially when we talk about Trika Shaiva or we talk about Advaita Vedanta, there is a certain element of integrative experiential understanding, a certain way in which we see the unity that we have with that which we are perceiving. So that is a very important aspect that I would like to highlight out here. In the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, for instance, we have this understanding that mechanical practice is not as good as, let's say, knowledge, and knowledge is not as good as, let's say, meditation, which is a direct way of looking at the things that we're trying to understand and having an experiential way to do that, not just in terms of the intellectual or the religious side of it, so to say. So here they say that Shreyo hi jnanabhyasya jnana dhyanam visheshyate, right? So which is basically this idea that something which is better than mechanical practice is knowledge, and that which is better than knowledge is meditation, right? And this idea of how we look at the subject-object binary is further nuanced by the understanding of the Jain philosophy, which also looks at anekantavad, which is one of the fundamental premises of Jain philosophy. And the most famous example or illustration of this is that of the elephant and the blind men, which I think a parable that many of us have heard as children. So the idea here is that if there are a number of blind men and they have access to an elephant and they are touching some part of the elephant and interpreting what an elephant actually is, they will have very different understandings of the elephant. So one person, if he's looking at the trunk, may call it a snake, let's say, something like a snake. Person looking at the side of the elephant will talk of it as a wall, potentially. And somebody touching the feet would look at it as a pillar, let's say, right? So all of them in their own ways are having access to some degree of that reality, which is of the elephant, but they're interpreting it in many different ways, right? So the element of diverse perspectives is something which is very, very integral to the way in which we have looked at the subject-object binary in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. Trika Shaiva Darshan. I would like to highlight that Trika Shaivism in general is a very advanced and a very nuanced and comprehensive way of looking at the world. And the reason I'm talking about the subject-object binary here is to slowly introduce this idea of dualism, which is that there are these boundaries that exist in the universe as we perceive it. There are ways in which the subject and object are not seen as part of one, right? And there are certain fundamental problems when we look at the universe in that way, right? And this realization has been there from times immemorial in the ancient times as well, which led to a very systematic manner of, perceiving or conceptualizing the non-dualism that we talk about. And within that, the Trika Shaiva Darshan obviously is a very important element, so to say. Today, when we talk about Kashmir, we talk about many different elements of politics, of civilizational strife in some ways as well, but more recently in terms of integration. But what we often forget is that Kashmir has been and had been a bastion of Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, of the various different aspects of knowledge that exist out there. So coming back to the subject-object binary from the Trika Shaiva Darshan, the Shiva Sutra kind of talks about the awareness of pure consciousness, and that awareness is what dissolves all conditionings and the constraints that exist. And so the subject represents the pure consciousness or the divine essence, while the object is symbolizing the external world and the manifestations thereof. So, for instance, there is this very famous aphorism, Tadara Rupa Pramitesh Takshaya Jiva Sangshaya, right? Which is basically looking at how you look at the unity of consciousness and how it dissolves all the conditionings and constraints. Trika Shaivad also talks about the illusion of duality, right? It says that when we talk about being separate from the external reality, this perceived separation basically fosters attachment, fosters desires, fosters suffering as well, right? You may all be familiar with Bodh Darshan, right? Bodh Parampara, where we talk about the suffering being because of attachments. But within the Trika Shaiva Darshan as well, and within the Shiva Sutra, various other texts, such as the Kshatrima Shatatva Sandoha, which is a significant text by Amritanandanatha, there is this element of how this perceived separation is a root cause of attachment, desire, and suffering. So, for instance, in this shloka, yad yamunuttaram murtina jetcha khalimidam jagat snushtum paspande saspandaha pratama shiva tattva machyute tagyai. Right? So the idea that the highest reality can be represented with the aspect of free will, or one's own will, basically. And this first vibration, as I have mentioned out here, represents the essence of Shiva, right? So you see in this shloka, there is this aspect of Shiva tattva muchyate, right? And so that is what is being referred to. And this non-dualistic perspective is what makes the subject and object inseparable, right? So this whole idea of separability, which we have been talking about in the Western context, no longer exists, cannot exist when we talk about this particular idea or this particular strand of thought. And so that is the way in which the Trika Shaiva philosopher wants to transcend the dualistic perception, so to say. The Spanda Karika, I have mentioned a shlok here, which talks about a person's agitation is only kind of, transgress or transcended, rather, not transgress, but transcended when we talk about the realization of the supreme state of consciousness, right? So you have this shloka here, Nija Shuddha Samarthasya Kartaveshwa Bilashina Yada Shobha Pralyate Tadas Syat Paramam Padam, right? So in this we are talking about Nija Shuddhya, right? Nija Shuddhya Samarthasya Kartavye Veshwa Bhilashina, right? So there are many different aspects of a person's agitation, right? And there is a Shuddhi, or this aspect of purification that comes about when we do not have the realization, so to say, of the ultimate reality or the supreme state of consciousness. And that is what is being spoken about in the Spanda Karika out here. Going forward, this concept of how we seize this idea of separation, right? How we stop this distinction in appearance being so supreme is what is again spoken about in the Shiva Sutra. And I would like to spend a little time on this particular shlok, or this particular section of the shlok rather, which is talking about how the dissolution of perceived differences can actually lead to inherent creative powers or creativity, right, coming to the fore. So this is something which we see also within modern scientific context, right? When we are looking at the element of correlations, right? Correlative aspects of nature have been seen to be very important in places like condensed matter physics, in places like quantum mechanics as well. And this idea of correlations giving rise to something more, right, in terms of an emergent phenomena, an emergent reality, is something we often talk about in modern science. So in this particular shlok, we see Bheda Tiraskare, which means that if you do not agree or align with the idea of this perceived difference, Sarganta Karma Tattvam, right? So Bheda Tiraskare, Sargantara Karma Tattvam, right? So that there is a certain element of how the dissolution of perceived differences can allow for the enlightened seeker of Shiva to realize their inherent creative power, right? So when we're talking about the individual in this context, we're talking about a more spiritual aspect of looking at the individual. We're talking about what is known as a jiva, right? The individual soul, which is established through the matrika shaktis, right? There is a certain element of cosmic energies or the divine powers that exist. And it's very interesting that the term which you see is matrika shakti, right? Which is the way in which we talk about the different cosmic energies. And these energies can be in terms of bahya means external faculties, right? They can also be in terms of antahakarana, right? Antahakarana means the internal faculties that exist, right? So, for instance, in Abhinav Gupta's teachings, we often see this idea of antahakarana, right? And how we look at the purification of the antahakarana, the movement towards the ultimate reality of consciousness itself. And this is elaborated in the Tantra Loka, for instance, which says that the Trika, right? The Trika is basically the the para, apara, and para apara, which is basically different ways in which we look at consciousness. I wouldn't go into too much detail on that because that itself is a whole different dimension of elaborating on this. But this process known as unconditioned emanation, which Abhinav Gupta talks about, describes how the entire universe is basically a reflection of the supreme reality that we see out there, right? So, for instance, here it says, Tathanta stha paramarsha bhedena vastuta strikam anutare chon shakhyam yato vishvam vimarshanam, right? So here, if you look at some of the words here, which is to do with anuttare, right? Anuttare again goes back to the idea of anuttara, right? Vishvam vimarshanam, right? Vishvam vimarshanam, and also the idea of stha paramarsha bhedena, right? Tathanta stha paramarsha bhedena, and then there is anuttare, right? And then also Vishwam Vimarshanam, right? So basically this idea of Vimarsha, right? Vimarsha, this idea of how the Vishwam is coming about, right? In terms of an unconditioned emanation, right? That is what is the primary element that is being spoken of in the Tantra Lok by Abhinav Gupta. So then we come to the Shiva Sutra, which is talking about how the yogi attains mastery over the various aspects of Maya or ignorance, right? And that is being referred to as a comprehensive victory, so to say.